Today at the webinar, we will have a presentation by Robbie Epsom. He's Senior Director and Head of Sustainability for EMEA at CBRE Investment Management. And after his speech, we'll have a panel discussion chaired by Tjidsger Wierda. He's partner and corporate ESG consulting at Walvius Group. And we will have a number of high-profile participants in the panel discussion with a fairly different background. So it's promising to be an interesting discussion. As for general info for today, I encourage everyone in the audience to come up with questions or comments. Down there you can see in the menu there is a Q&A, or you can just leave a comment. I'm happy to sort of pass all those questions on to our speakers, and Robbie in particularly encouraged me to have Q&A from the audience. So let's all ask him some questions about what he sees as the most important issues for net zero and ESG trends for this year. For those of you who are joining now, I'm Tana Csiros, founder and CEO of Property Forum. Welcome to our webinar today. Welcome to Net Zero Property Update 2024. As I said, we're going to start with a presentation by Robbie Epsom, who is Head of Sustainability at EMEA at CBRE Investment Management. So without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to Robbie. Welcome to the show. Hi.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity from Property Forum to present today and share my views, but also the views from CBRE Investment Management on net zero, but also importantly on ESG trends for 2024. It's an exciting time for sustainability. For those of you that work in it every day, it's been a very busy last 3 or 4 years with sustainability. It doesn't seem to be slowing down, which is great news. It's what we've always wished for, but equally it creates work and challenges as we work through the best way to implement things in the built environment. My name is Robbie Epsom. I'm the EMEA Head of Sustainability at CBRE Investment Management. Today, I've been asked to say some words on European ESG trends for 2024. So I'll take you through a bit of context first, where I currently see things, and then I'll focus in on what I see as 3 key trends for the year ahead for 2024, looking particularly at net zero, given the series of this webinar, but also linking in some wider topics, which I think is really important. Before I jump in, just to give a bit of background as to who I am, so you have a bit more context on my background, my experience. I come from a foundation of sustainability advisory consultancy. I trained as a chemical process engineer, depending which part of the world you're dialing in from, and so very much come from a technical background when it comes to tackling sustainability. I spent 12 years in sustainability advisory, advising across the whole economy, so not just real estate directly, supporting major blue chip companies and infrastructure projects around the world. My specialism, given that background in chemical process engineering, is topics like net zero, greenhouse gas accounting, things like circular economy. And I really do push beyond just the day job wherever I've worked to make sure that I'm part of shaping the direction of travel for those topics, and will represent both the company, CBRE Investment Management, but also institutes like the Institute of Environmental Science, where I'm a member at things like COP28 recently in Dubai, but also I'll be traveling to Paris later this week as part of the follow-up to that excellent outcome we have from COP28 with the Buildings Breakthrough Agenda, to be meeting with how we take that forwards with other leaders across the world, how we start to take forward those goals that were agreed at COP28 around that Buildings Breakthrough Agenda. So if we're not connected, please do connect, and you'll be seeing updates from me as that meeting progresses later in this week. Really exciting stage for net zero. In terms of how I approach ESG, I take a very technical view, looking at the mass and energy balance, if you like, looking at the flows of mass, those raw materials, the waste, the water, and energy, electricity, gas, the fuels that power our buildings that flow through those systems. And whether this be a single building or an entire city, the principles are very much the same. And this very much is the principles that underline ESG criteria and the various accounting improvements that we have to do with ESG. The built environment very much is the common thread that flows through everything. So as I was a consultant working across the economy, advising all these different companies, these projects, the one common thread was always the built environment. Whatever the business activity, manufacturing, retail, logistics, consultancy, law, whatever it might be, I always found myself quantifying the impact of their buildings, because within those buildings was their manufacturing, was their retail stores, was the warehousing that they did, were their offices. And so it always came back to buildings. And with 40% of greenhouse gas emissions being attributed to construction and operation of buildings, even more if you include infrastructure, the built environment is a fundamental part of the greenhouse gas global challenge, and therefore also a big part of the opportunity. And we recognize that at CBRE Investment Management, and that's why climate is one of our 3 focus areas in our vision. And what's really worrying, if you look at the latest IPCC report, this is the technical report that looks at progress on climate change and provides the necessary recommendations from the scientific community as to where we go next. They found that over the last 20 years, that the built environment, despite great progress on things like energy efficiency, has effectively stood still because of that growth in the floor area. So there's a huge action to take as we shift into 2024, as we go forwards, to decouple growth in floor area, development, things like that, to make sure that we are able to continue to drive down greenhouse gas emissions in aggregate across the sector. But the built environment is the key thing. And that is very much why I jumped in-house 3 years ago into CBRE Investment Management to help launch our vision and to then help implement that across Europe, because of the opportunity and the scale that we have to drive change, particularly in the investment management sector. In terms of the context, from factory to field, from home to hospital, our lives depend on the built environment. In fact, I'd go as far as saying the entirety of the human economy operates within the built environment, whether that be real estate or infrastructure, all the things that go on in between. And I think the key word here is built environment, as opposed to natural environment. And that's because the built piece there is artificial by design, and therefore it requires careful management to integrate it as closely to nature as possible, to try to match that natural mass and energy balance in a way which adopts circular economy principles and is regenerative. And if you take it from a pure technological perspective, we took some wrong turns in the way we construct and operate buildings, the built environment more widely. The economy very much, as many of you will know, is set up on a linear take, make, dispose principle of manufacturing construction materials and products and building things in a very linear way. We take resources from the ground, we make something, and then we dispose of them at the end of life. And a reliance on polluting finite fuels, the natural gases, the oils, the things that power our buildings. And so there is a change that needs to happen. And that's not just driven by environmental needs, that's driven by a technological need. This is becoming now part of due diligence. This is one of the big changes as we enter 2024. This is becoming part of the operational efficiency of the building, part of the longevity and the survival of buildings, of businesses. And I genuinely believe that we are at a crossroads for humanity. And I don't say this in a negative way, but as a positive opportunity. In my view, we are living through the largest industrial revolution in human history, one where we are not only innovating at a pace never seen before to create new technology and new business models, but where we are simultaneously redefining and reimagining nearly all existing technologies and existing ways of working. This is a hugely exciting time to be alive, to be in the business world, and to be part of this change. And it's not just sustainability that's driving that, it's artificial intelligence, it's many things, but there are very common links and threads across these big topics. And so it is a hugely exciting time, but with any big change, any great change like this, also comes great resistance. And as we enter 2024, we can already see the old economy starting to push back. And this is hitting the built environment through things like EV charging and heat pumps and the electrification of buildings. And we're starting to see a lot of negative campaigns as the old economy tries to let go and we shift into a new economy, underpinned by quite different principles and quite different technologies. And one of the things I really like to pull this all back to is, with all of us on this call today working in property in various ways, we are all custodians of this built environment. In some cases, you take CBRE Investment Management, we have 150 billion or thereabouts in terms of assets under management across real estate and real assets and infrastructure. That is a virtual city spread across the planet in many cases. And this is a huge opportunity because it allows us within our businesses, within our day jobs, to drive systematic change at scale in a way that transcends borders, in a way that often the decisions that governments and others make can't do. So this is a big opportunity for us and something that we can do at scale, coming back to that whole wrapper of how the entire economy operates within the built environment. And if we can drive the right kind of positive change at the building level, then by default, we change what's happening within the building. So if I pause there on the context and shift now into the trends. So if I were to pick 3 key trends as we shift into 2024, it would be consolidation of methodologies. It would be formalization of sustainability KPIs, and it would be building beyond net zero as a topic. And this has been the kind of culmination of 3 or 4 years of very rapid progress. For those of you that are in sustainability back in 2019, that was the year where we said sustainability or ESG entered the boardroom. And that was a huge moment. It took a real shift change and it has not slowed down. And what I like to say is, in Europe now, as we enter 2024, we are past the why. That's great. But we're now into the how and the when. How can we transition, and when is the optimal time for each of these actions that we're pushing? But if I take those 3 trends in part, consolidation of methodologies firstly, this is catalyzing action by removing hesitancy, and it's allowing us to focus efforts. There's been a lot of delay, a lot of hesitation in the market over recent years as we waited for clear definitions on net zero, as we waited for clear definitions on how we calculate and report and where we do it. And we're seeing, as we enter 2024, with things like the Race to Zero launched several years back, pulling together net zero under things like Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, the Net Zero Asset Management Initiative for our sector, and wider for other sectors. They are pulling together the definitions and the way of doing net zero. The ISSB and the IWA42, lots of acronyms. These are now standards coming from ISO, coming from the IFRS, that are consolidating methodologies, TCFD, net zero thinking, under single umbrellas, pulling the world together. Much of this being driven out of Europe to have a common way of calculating, reporting, and engaging on things like net zero and more widely ESG. And this is accelerating action because it's giving confidence that people can continue in a way that they know the wider market is doing. And that's one of the first key trends as we move into 2024. And 2024 is the year that we see the final bits of consolidation, like that ISSB, like the IWA42 shifting to an ISO standard. And really the adoption phase is starting now at scale. The second trend is the one that really excites me for the built environment, for the property sector, is the formalization of sustainability KPIs, a shift from ESG being a peripheral reporting into it being a non-financial reporting integrated alongside our financial reporting. And this is huge because it is driving value creation relating to ESG. It's unlocking the trillions of investments needed to drive this transition. It's allowing for a success point to be reached. And it's things like SFDR, the Sustainable Financial Disclosure Regulation, EU taxonomy, and recently RICS, the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors in the UK, launched just literally last month, the future of real estate valuations, the impact of ESG, providing guidance to the valuation community on ESG KPIs. These are allowing a clear, comparable, like-for-like definition of ESG in the built environment. What does highly efficient look like? What does a zero emission building mean? And with these, we have clear success points. If you invest this much more in a refurb, you will achieve the point where this building will be classed as highly efficient in an office asset in the Mediterranean climatic zone, whatever it might be. It's giving us very clear, absolute, comparable KPIs, which we can start to assign value to. And that unlocks investment and is a very exciting step forwards as we move into 2024. And thirdly, building beyond net zero is a huge one for 2024. The last couple of years and many years before that, but particularly the last couple of years, net zero has been the focus and is very much the focus of today's call. And that has now reached a point where we have foundations. Many have integrated net zero targets, commitments, and built processes around that into their business. As we move into 2024, we are using that same foundation to build in the wider topics, to integrate those wider key integrated topics such as climate resilience, biodiversity, social value, whole life carbon, and building on that framework to integrate those into our processes, into our expectations in terms of targets and the way forwards. And this is so important because these aren't topics in their own right. These are things which are quite often linked very heavily to net zero. And a good example of that is as we all get towards the end of those net zero journeys and we get to the point of residual greenhouse gas emissions and we need to invest in things like carbon removal, biodiversity and nature will play a significant part in that. But equally, where you increase biodiversity, you also improve social value. And where you increase social value at the asset level, you can also improve things like indoor air quality. So there's lots of synergies between these topics. And the exciting progress we've made in net zero over recent years provides a very strong foundation to build these topics in. And I believe in 2024, you will see things like biodiversity and social value now really starting to rise up the agenda, because this foundation allows businesses to start to progress even where there's an absence of things like a social taxonomy. Businesses, in my view, want to get moving. But it also opens up very exciting conversations around things like development versus refurb, around things like whole life carbon. So 3 key trends, in my view: consolidation of methodologies, formalization of sustainability KPIs, and building beyond net zero. If I were to finish with just a call to action on net zero, but wider sustainability, from mighty cities to humble homes, the built environment is both the problem, but as I said at the beginning, it's also the solution. So I call on all of us here today as custodians of virtual cities to drive scalable and systematic change across your realms of influence. If we can change the wrapper of the built environment to an energy efficient, fully electric one, with all highly efficient electricity sourced from either on-site renewables, where feasible, or credible off-site renewables, then we have zero emission buildings, and therefore we have zero emission occupiers. And then all we need to do is collaborate with our value chain to do the same. The roadmap is that simple. The challenge is the how and the when, and that will take our collective minds to unlock. But we need to move faster. There's a lot of work to do by 2030. And I think that's probably a good place to pause and open up to Q&A, because there's a lot to discuss, and I think it would be nice to take some questions.
Right. Thank you so much, Robbie. As also Robbie mentioned, I also encourage everyone to come up with any questions here in the Q&A section. We've got one so far, and it sort of rhymes with your last remark about electricity. It said, I would like to ask about green electricity. How do you see the issue of offsetting electricity in buildings through the purchase of guarantees of origin? Do you think this trend will persist? Is it a reliable measure of reducing carbon emissions, and should it be involved in decarbonization analysis?
Yeah, it's an important question, probably a gap in many strategies at the moment, and it's probably happened organically as we've all developed our thinking on this. The reality is you're not going to be able to get on-site renewables at every asset. It's just that is not feasible, particularly in urban environments and particularly on certain asset classes. So there is always going to be a need to procure off-site renewables, and our net zero strategy follows what we call the 4 E's: energy efficiency being first, electrification being second, and the third one is energy procurement. And that's split into 2 parts. Part 1 is on-site renewables where feasible, and we have to have a strategy in place to make sure that's done in a good way. But the second part of that is, what does credible off-site renewables look like? And there is a gap in that definition. REGOs, RECs, things like that, those guarantees of origin are being looked at as the means of evidencing it. So at the moment, the focus is on, if you are going to procure off-site, make sure you have the evidence. But absolutely, in terms of the net zero journey, not all renewable energy is going to be able to be produced on site. So there is going to be a need to procure, whether it be through virtual PPAs, power purchase agreements, or guarantee of origins, REGOs, RECs, and things like that. It's going to be a key part of it. But challenges, like with carbon removal, that offsetting piece, taking greenhouse gas emissions out of the atmosphere, it has to be credible. And what we need to do is collaborate on a consistent definition so that we all know that when we're talking about procurement of credible offsite, we are all talking to the same level of quality and robustness, because we want to avoid double accounting and inaccuracies.
Right. You mentioned methodology as an important issue. In my experience, a lot of stakeholders in the real estate sector usually complain about the lack of transparent or clear methodology, and the need for, you know, a more quantified methodology and so on. Do you think there's enough progress in that, or and do you expect a lot to happen in the next couple of months, years or so?
I think a lot of progress got made over the last year or so, particularly around net zero methodologies. There were a lot of initiatives that had developed their own methodologies, and if we go back to the basics of greenhouse gas accounting, you had things like the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, ISO 14064, you know, the sort of principles of ultimately greenhouse gas accounting, but there was always an absence of how do you define net zero, and what does a net zero sort of framework look like. In 2023, the IWA International Working Agreement 42 was launched, which is the world's first net zero guidelines, and that provides a global foundation on how to define net zero and what are the kind of 10 key principles in terms of doing that in a consistent and credible way. And it's very likely, albeit this is my opinion, that will flip to a full ISO standard in the near future. And that very much gives us a global definition for net zero and a global framework for what best practice looks like. And from that, you can start to build on the details that each sector might need in terms of doing that consistency. So that's a big step forwards, because when you don't have a clear definition and a clear way of approaching it, it creates hesitancy. And often people will use that as an excuse to wait until a method comes out. So now that we have this, it is an excellent step forwards, and I think things like the ISSB consolidation of the other methods around things like SASB and TCFD, lots of acronyms in sustainability, all of this is very positive as well, because they are reducing reporting burden, encouraging consistency, and removing that hesitancy where there's worry about that kind of risk of going down the wrong path when it comes to methodology, because it's not cheap to put in place the process to do this, and people want to make sure they're heading down the right path before they invest too heavily.
Sure. Speaking of best practices, as head of EMEA at CBRE investment, do you have an overview of different markets when it comes to ESG? Are there any regions, countries, cities to look out for, you know, for best practices or good examples at least, or exceptional progress when it comes to net zero either, or ESG in general?
Yeah, I think the EU as a whole has been a leader, in my view, on sustainability. The UK as well produces a lot in terms of standards, guidance, and a lot of initiatives. The two countries that keep me the most busy in Europe are probably the UK and the Netherlands. There's a huge amount of business enthusiasm and market drivers that come out of those two countries. France and Germany are starting to move very quickly as well, and you're seeing a lot of regulation coming out of those countries as well. But the UK and the EU, with things like SFDR, the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation coming out of the EU, the FCA's SDR, Sustainable Disclosure Requirements coming out of the UK, are becoming like a seesaw of progress, where one moves, the other moves next. There's improvements, and there's sort of meeting in the middle coming on sustainability regulations and standards. But the will in Europe, I mentioned in when I was talking, we're past the why. I very rarely find across the EU as a whole, the UK, that there's much convincing to do anymore. We're more at the discussion now of how do we do this in an effective way, and that's why, you know, in countries like France, you're seeing regulation around things like rooftop solar on car park canopies coming into place, where there's over 80 spaces. You're seeing green roof legislation. You're seeing things like anti-greenwashing laws coming in that later this year in the UK. There is a huge amount of progress, and I think Europe is very much pushing this out to the world. And I'm seeing things that are originating in Europe now making their way out to North America and Asia Pacific. And I think that's really exciting. We're very much at the heart of the sustainability innovation at the moment.
That's great to hear. A few questions slash comments from the audience. One is that, are we sure that the next step for energy efficient buildings is electricity, or we could see some other sources like hydrogen or natural gas that could be something that we will see in the near future?
It's a really good question, and it's a difficult one to answer, because I think sustainability by nature should never be a one size fits all. I think the whole purpose of sustainability is to look at your local environment and work out what is the best way to utilize nature in the vicinity of this building, of this infrastructure. I think there's never a single answer to this. Electrifying buildings is probably the biggest silver bullet, if we were to call it that, because that allows you to then solve the problem of shifting to renewable energy centrally through industrial size renewable sort of facilities. But there is always a place for everything. Hydrogen, for example, is starting to be adopted for things like energy storage, industrial scale batteries. I've read recently, I think. Natural gas does have a place in the short term as a transition, but in the short term, I feel quite strongly that that does still need to be phased out. I know many don't agree with that, but it is a complicated economy, and therefore there never is a one size fits all. You know, geothermal I see works quite well in cities like Paris, less so in London. There's different reasons for that. Air source heat pumps work in some situations, whereas ground source in others. So there's so many things to consider. What we try and do from a strategic perspective as CBRE Investment Management, because we manage this virtual city, is to focus on the guide rails and the principles, and then provide the support to allow them to think through the best solution at each asset, case by case. So we know we want to electrify assets. How we electrify them, we allow to be different based on the asset type, the location, the pace at which they might need to do that. And all of this whilst new technology is coming out at pace. And I'm sure in 5 years' time, there'll be technology I haven't even conceived of coming onto the market. So again, we have to be flexible and dynamic in our thinking on this as well.
All right, Robbie, thanks a lot for joining us and sharing your views on the most important ESG trends. It was great having you with us.
No problem. Thank you for the opportunity, and yeah, feel free to send through any questions I didn't get to afterwards. But thanks for the chance.
Yeah, and hope to see you in person as well soon. As I mentioned earlier, next up is a panel discussion discussing the most important ESG challenges and trends for the CE real estate market, sort of summarizing of what's expected in 2024. So I'd like to ask the chair, the moderator of the next discussion, to please join me. It's Tjidsger Wierda. As I mentioned, he's partner at the Walvius Group. I could say he's a regular speaker at different online and personal property forum events. A very experienced ESG expert. So I'd like to welcome Tjidsger with us here in the show. Hi, how are you?
Good afternoon. Thank you very much. Good to see you too. It's been a while.
Yeah, it's been a while. It's been a while. So what? I assume you've been following Robbie's speech just now, to sort of setting the scene also for the next discussion. In your view, what's the number one trend or number one concern when it comes to ESG and real estate in Europe?
So I think I would like to connect to a couple of things that Robbie said, which I wholeheartedly agree with. One that really caught my attention is the fact that, of course, the European Union is very much leading the way when it comes to rules and regulation, which now, it kind of forces companies to now do something, because if you're a large company with more than 500 people, by law, you now have to report. And let's be realistic that within the real estate sector, you don't require that many buildings to pass the financial threshold. And depending on where you are, the net turnover threshold is relatively easy to be passed as well. So I think that the unification and the consolidation of legislation, again, especially within the European Union, I think is something that will very much shape what's going to happen this year, also next year, because of course it's flowing into the smaller companies as well over the next couple of years. Yeah, that's one of the main things that I see becoming key for many companies over the coming years.
Yeah, I agree. This has also caught my attention that, I think a lot of stakeholders in Europe are complaining that EU legislations are in general too strict or way too progressive, and it sort of gives them let's say competitive disadvantage. But at least we can see that it has a global impact as well, which is very, very important. So without further ado, I'll give the floor to Tjidsger and leave you with the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. So welcome to everybody who's joining on the other side of the camera. But I would also love to welcome, of course, Nicole, Hubert, Eleni, and Monika to this panel. And considering you're the ones sharing most of your knowledge, can I ask you to quickly share with the audience who you are, what it is you do? And let's start with Nicole.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm honored to be here among very experienced panelists, and thank you for the invitation. I'm the head of business development for ESG and sustainability services at CBRE Romania. And my goal is to enhance CBRE's impact locally by closely working with our clients to help them achieve their sustainability goals and create greener and healthier properties for both landlords and occupiers. I am part of a specialized CBRE ESG and sustainability team of 20 professionals across the CE region, almost 300 at continental Europe level, and 600 globally. I have over 16 years of experience in business development, specifically in the construction and real estate sectors, and I personally have a keen interest in creating sustainable habits in everyone around me. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Hubert.
Yes, hello. I'm Hubert Abt. I'm 35 years plus in the industry. We're dealing with ESG since always 5 years now. Workcloud 24 is operating in Germany, Austria, and the 6 CE countries. We help our clients to make the transformation towards whatever is net zero in the future. Means ESG certificates, ESG benchmarking on GRESPs. We have a monitoring and management system as a technology marketplace. So it's basically a one-stop shop for all kind of asset classes of commercial properties.
Right. Thank you very much. Eleni.
Hi, everybody. Great to be here. I'm Eleni Polychroniadou. I'm the CEO and co-founder of a company called Sintali. We sit on a slightly different side of ESG, so we're verifying all of the ESG credentials. We primarily work on them for a World Bank green building certificate called EDGE, which is present across Europe, but across the world. So we're working in over 80 countries and really making sure to monitor that environmental impact and tying into all of the lovely ESG trends, particularly around greenwashing, and just making sure that progress is.
Wonderful. And then last but not least, Monika.
Thank you very much indeed, and a very warm good afternoon to everyone. I'm Monika Dębska-Pastakia. I have been in the real estate industry for quite a longish while, over 30 years, currently heading real estate team KPMG in Poland, focusing on assisting clients in the transformation of their real estate portfolios, in the transition to circular economy, in the transition to absorb and comply with ESG requirements, especially in the context of valuation, and also in terms of financing, focusing on financing or refinancing their existing property portfolios in the context of the requirements of retrofit. So that's the main focus, and this is just a process that is starting in our part of the world, part of Europe. Thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you very much, Monika. So let's start with the first question that I have, and it's a short one. So I would like each of you, and we're going in the same order, to give us 3 words as to what you would say ESG in real estate is about at this moment. So let's again start with Nicole. You're on mute, Nicole.
There I am. So sorry, just 3 words, yeah? Keywords.
Yes.
3 words.
Yes.
So I would say, and I would start, not by accident, by anti-greenwashing. Number 2, digitalization. And number 3, green finance.
All right. Hubert.
I would say it's to develop the real estate in a level of quality which gives also the next generation purpose to use it. So basically, it's backwards to the 100-year life cycle, which was originally in place before all the capital markets came up with changing the asset class to kind of bonds and leaving the real estate as only a finance purpose.
All right. It's a few more, but let's summarize it as going back to the 100-year cycle. Eleni.
I'm going to be a little bit controversial, actually, and say the 3 words I would say right now for ESG are maintaining status quo. And I'm very happy to elaborate on that later.
Yes, please. That's quite interesting indeed. We'll come back to that one. Monika.
I would say 3 words: transition, finance, and valuations, incorporating ESG credentials.
All right, wonderful. Those are some interesting words indeed. I heard finance twice. So later in the conversation, let's see if we can really get that one going, because I whatever event we go to, finance always comes back, and I think it's quite an interesting topic. Good, Eleni, I would like to start with you on my next question, and the question is: do you think the existing multi-criteria certification systems truly capture the long-term environmental impact of a building? And would you change anything?
I think many things. I think certification is not the be-all, end-all, and it's simply a validation of progress and a validation of performance improvement. So certification should never be used as the way to say, great, we've done everything that we need to do and there's no environmental impact. It's simply a way to communicate to stakeholders, a way to communicate to finance, which you mentioned, that certain elements are better. Now, there's a blessing and a curse with the multi-criteria sustainability certifications, in that the more criteria you add and the more complex you make it, the less accessible you make it. And the less accessible means the less scale that we have, which means we end up in a situation where we are right now, which is mostly a big gap between the top leading developers and the top real estate assets and everything. So you have some assets that are really sustainable, really forward-looking, and then you've got the majority of the smaller buildings, the residential buildings, the local hospitals, the schools, all of the buildings where there isn't a clear commercial case for sustainability that are not meeting certain criteria. So it's important to consider, what is the role of certification? What is it really there to do? And to also account for the fact that every year we learn something new about sustainability. What we know today may not be exactly true in 10 years because we're constantly learning about the interconnection between different elements of sustainability, the boundaries, the ways in which we have to make certain decisions about impacts in one area versus the other. So I don't think anyone today can say that their building is fully covered for every long-term environmental implication, whether it's certified or not.
Well, thank you very much. And one of the words that I heard was the word barrier to entry, because it becomes more complex. And even though it's not entirely the same topic, Nicole, I did prepare a question on barriers, and that is the barriers to implementing ESG strategies.
Right. So I believe that first barrier is the lack of, I mean, at least regionally here, the lack of standardization and the fact that many investors have only a grasp of the environmental elements. And we are now seeing an increasing requirement to understand deeper, into the social and well-being components of ESG. So I think one of the barriers is the lack of education, and we have a big task on this. The second would be, I believe, the let's say the context, the financial context currently, which is, putting a bit of strain on the economies, the higher cost of capital, the decline in asset values. So that's, to me, one of the things that is preventing the implementation of sustainability strategies to the full. Another one would be lack of technology and digitalization. A lot of investors and building owners are relying upon, I would say, static modeling and not using the dynamic modeling, which I hopefully will have the chance to talk about it later on in the discussion. What else would that be? Again, the array of certifications, which is, I don't know, and maybe Hubert, you can confirm, we're having about, what, more than 80 certifications going around, so that's quite a lot. Then lack of finance, lack of green finance or green initiatives per se, which is starting to be the case, but insurance companies need to pick up, banks need to really, walk the talk. Maybe there are others, but that come to my mind right now. So, okay.
Hubert, Nicole did refer to you with a question. So now I guess we're all really curious what your ideas are on the certification.
Only a fool believes that a certificate makes a sustainable building. So it's all about the next step. And as any journey starts with the first step, it's all about the first step. So basically, it's not so complicated as the regulation wants to make us believe. But coming back to the first statement, we need to be aware that since the Paris Agreement and the so-called Green Deal, by the time when it was taken up by the politicians and it ended up in the EU taxonomy, it's from there a political discussion, or not anymore a purely science-based discussion, right? So all tools which we need are in place for years. All the ISO norms are there for 10, 15 years. Even European norms are there for 10 years. GREM glide path is there 2018, right? So you don't need to have new tools. You just need to start the journey, and with the first collecting the data, you will learn so much about your building, you will be fully surprised, and then you can accelerate to a sophisticated ERP system or whatever, and that's always the basis for any kind of certificate or benchmark, right? So I guess we should go back and just do what we need to do, collecting the data, analyzing the data. And for that, we do not need to have a certificate. We just need to start to do it and not to talk about it. Because if we don't do it, then it's will creating really a transformation risk. We only have 5.5 years from now on to reduce the carbon on 50%. And that's the challenge. And I don't know how long we want to wait for it, because time is ticking. And if you want to apply for a credit facility, average is 5 years, you're falling in the risk category, unlikely risk to pay, because by the end of the facility, you can't prove that you reduce 50%, you're out of business, right? So I guess it's more really going into the doing instead of waiting for the next certificate and the next regulation. Of course, it's a moving target. It's very clear what we do today. In 5 years, maybe we talk completely different things. But what remains is always the basis. That will not change.
I heard a couple of interesting things. You mentioned that it's not that difficult, but of course we do have to reduce our emissions by 50% by 2030. Monika, if I may pose the question to you, where do you then start? Because on the one hand, it sounds like it's easy. On the other hand, 50% by 2030.
Well, it's one of the challenges in terms of starting point. Jenny speaking, if you look at the portfolio, you probably start with an audit just to understand what is your current position within your portfolio, energy audit, for example, as a starting point. And then you'll be looking at various positions, trying to ascertain what can be done, especially if you have a portfolio without any certifications in place, older buildings perhaps that require retrofit, bearing in mind that you have to move in the direction of meeting some of the ESG credentials, especially if your portfolio is leveraged. If it comes to, say, refinancing your portfolio, then there will be numerous questions coming from the banks asking about meeting various KPIs. And if your portfolio doesn't meet those KPIs, then frankly, we're already seeing the evidence of banks' refusal to refinance property portfolios. And this is one of the main principal challenges, bearing in mind that the building stock in Europe is clearly of varying degrees of in terms of age. Western Europe has certainly quite a number of buildings which are slightly older than perhaps in some parts of Central Eastern Europe. But having said that, the requirements to retrofit buildings is pretty substantial, bearing in mind that about 70% of all buildings in Europe will require deep retrofit. Deep retrofit meaning quite substantial amounts of money will have to be invested. And in some cases, that is equating to anything between 10 to 30% of the property's market value. So in that sense, the question really is, how can we possibly finance that retrofit requirement, which we know is going to be very substantial, and the building owners, the property owners, don't necessarily have the cash ready and waiting to deploy in retrofitting their buildings. So that's just a very quick overview of the challenges in that respect.
I would challenge that, Monika.
Mm-hmm.
We have proof that with the first taking the low-hanging fruits, you can make 50% of the savings with less than 5 to 10% of the total investment of a deep retrofit. And this is not coming from us only. This is always a study from UK, from Colliers, published about 5 years ago. So, and we know from the implementation results that it works. It works best when you have the management power. Let's say in a commercial building, you have much more efficiency as, for example, in a residential building, when everybody can do what they like to do, right? Open the window and at the same time don't shut down the heating. but having only in mind for an example, and that doesn't make the big thing, but it's a nice example for everybody to follow up. 60% of the energy consumption on elevators goes for standby, right? Not for transportation. So if you shut down 3 of the 4 elevators out of the business hours, you have already a lot of savings on this particular cost part of elevators. And the same is for workload sensors, right? You have a return on invest on the meeting room if you shut down the standby TVs and the stuff. And this is what I mean. So by engaging and educating the users, not talking about deep retrofit, you have so much more savings by changing the user behavior. And I guess this is the first step to go, because we know if you do a deep retrofit or you build a perfectly net zero building, brand new, you will always have 50% of the total carbon emission by the users, by the commuting and the using, right? So I guess the changing the user behavior is really the same. So raising awareness, and what we said before, it comes with education, it comes with C-level support. But from this part, we can do at least as much with the deep retrofit. And as you mentioned, we can't finance it. It's a mission impossible. The 220 million commercial buildings in Europe can't be transformed in the next 6-7 years, because we only have 2.5 or 3% per year, which we can transform. That gives us 10-15%, means 85% is left. So it's a mission impossible. But if I see it's a mission impossible, I need to change my plan. That's my plea.
Sure, fully agreed. You were talking about light retrofit, which is clearly underway, especially in when you're looking at say larger market players, investment funds that have already done quite a lot in terms of light retrofitting, saving anything between 10 and 50%. Of the energy use, and that is being done. But this is obviously a sort of like a stopping point whereby they reach certain threshold beyond which they have to move into the deep retrofit. So it all depends on the sort of geographical location of the properties and the various other conditions, whether they achieve 10% or say 50%. It's all really, it all varies. However, obviously this is a starting point, and the larger market players have already done that, and they reach a point whereby they're not moving any further, because obviously that will require them to move into the deep retrofit, which then opens the whole sort of like gate into the retrofit finance. And that is really the process, and that's the sequence that I have been observing, talking to various investment funds, working alongside them, and trying to understand, okay, how can we accelerate the process? How can we move faster? Bearing in mind that only 3% of our buildings in Europe are A graded in energy class. And we have to move pretty fast in order to reach that level. Frankly, a number of buildings will not be able to reach that level ever. And therefore the question is, how far can we move from the current energy class to the much higher energy class within the next 5.5 years? So we're opening a lot of questions here, I'm sure. But that was indeed. So that was just a very quick snapshot on that point. Thank you.
Yeah, Monika, you mentioned EPC, rating class and so on. But the problem is that EPC framework is still essentially local and varies across the country.
Yes.
So property owners with portfolios around Europe should look for beyond the EPC, because that's not giving them any benchmark whatsoever. And this is why, employing various strategies like, this digital twin that I like to talk about is very important, both in operation and in core design changes, let's say, of the buildings. So I think there are instances where even if we have a building that's, rated at the higher end of the scale, performs far worse than their rating indicates. So, you know, this sort of instances, you know, require the building owner, the investor, to get deeper into knowing how the building behaves. And it's not only having the utility bills data, which barely scratches the surface, but rather, you know, combining deep data about the building, understanding how to act upon it, you know, reducing energy consumption, but also tackling subjects like, for instance, is the building fabric really inefficient? How do I know that? Do I need to check the thermal performance and the air tightness of the building? Everything is very important when you make this modeling, to be able to know exactly where where you have to invest, where you have to go back to the tenant in operation and make sure he's doing the best as well. Because as Hubert said, there are a lot of low-hanging fruits out there. We need to be aware of them and grab them before we dive into deep core changes of the building that require, you know, big money to retrofit.
Indeed, and the starting point, the starting point really is the energy efficiency certification, just to understand where we are. And frankly, when you're looking at the value of the building, and that is the key question now. Okay, how do we approach the valuation, bearing in mind that we have to now take into account the ESG considerations after the publication of the IVS standards in January, and frankly, that is still an ongoing discussion amongst valuers, and clearly the energy efficiency certificates is actually a starting point, just trying to have something tangible. Fully understood that different jurisdictions have different bases for classification. I can only say that Poland doesn't have classification as yet, so they're just sort of simulations of classification to take into consideration.
And methodologies and updating methodologies. That's the thing, because we just have, for instance, here in Romania, we have a new methodology starting July last year, yeah, and that's changing the old methodology. But that needs to be unified. It's a requirement.
This is it.
Exactly.
This is the main. Sorry.
We're starting a really lively conversation, and I love that. It allows me to sit back a little bit. But let's keep in mind, Eleni, you have experience in auditing, so we're now really curious about your 2 cents.
Yeah, so I think I can probably bring in most of people's comments into a couple of examples and case studies. So we work with certain portfolio owners who have buildings across Europe, so UK, Spain, Portugal, Eastern Europe, Bulgaria, Romania, Greece, Cyprus. So really a mixed geographic distribution. Of course, as mentioned, the EPC ratings are different. In some cases, building regulations aren't quite up to EU yet. So one of the things that we've worked with with these clients who are in retail, actually not in office. I think office is its own sort of asset class to discuss versus other asset classes where it becomes a little bit harder in terms of valuation, monetization, etc. So this is all retail. And one of the things that they've done is basically approach, as we said, do that initial assessment. So for our certification edge, there's a software tool that pretty much does that assessment. So you can see where you are compared to the baseline in a specific country. So they're getting a unified approach, but a localized understanding of where it fits within retail in the specific country. And then to Hubert's point, it's about, if you look at all of your assets, where are the low-hanging fruit that you can do with a minimum amount of investment and the fastest ROI? How can you aggregate the bigger, deeper retrofit and access finance? And I think on the topic of finance, retrofit finance, at least from our conversations with folks, has been a huge challenge because of the size of the tickets. Individual buildings are just way too small to get the retrofit finance, and banks just don't want to spend the time and effort to be able to support the retrofit of a single building. And so that portfolio approach is super important, and tying it into a bigger decarbonization strategy that says, okay, I've got 1,500 assets across Europe. I know that out of those 1,500, 20% are performing decently, and with a little bit of investment, we can get them looking a lot better. I know that 40% of my assets are pretty bad and need a deep retrofit. But if I aggregate them together, I can possibly get green finance to do that and therefore able to invest in that. And then the rest are sort of in that longer term strategy to say, am I going to keep these assets and come to this bigger question of what happens to assets where the investment versus the outcome isn't quite right. And then we start talking about repurposing, about demolishing, and of course the environmental implication of that component. But companies are doing it across Europe, and it's very much trying to get those initial wins, get the ROI as much as possible, and then aggregate the rest of the assets and figure out that decarbonization strategy and get the right financing partners in place. I would say, at least from our experience with clients, getting financing for retrofit has been very challenging. It's a lot easier to get green construction loans or to get sustainability linked instruments than it is to get a retrofit type of product, although it is top of mind for most banks across Europe and really across the world.
Indeed,
Right.
that's a very good point, because you know, renewables is easy, but renewables doesn't work in all occasions, right? I mean, for instance, here locally, renewables has been booming with this resilience plan, national resilience plan, money from European Union for us. I mean, there's been a rooftop revolution here in Romania, which is, you know, putting a bit of a strain on the grid to be balanced on and so forth. But renewables is not only, you know, it's only a small part of the retrofit. Insulating the facade, insulating the roof, the glazing, everything else, that puts a huge cost on the investor's back, and this has to be somehow tackled by really clear incentives from the banks and from the governments. Given the fact that we are only at what, 1% at the European level, you know, in the renovation journey, and we have to be 2.5% by 2030. So it's 6 years from now. We are far away.
Wait, 2030 is not that far away.
I mean, we are far from being there, you know, on the track, you know, until 2030. So this is what I mean. It has to be accelerated.
Yeah. So one of the questions that I would prepare, and this is a topic that continuously comes back here, which is reusing and refurbishing of buildings, and a connection with that is, of course, also, I mean, one of the items that we're constantly talking about is emissions, and I have the idea that when we talk about emissions, very commonly we talk about the operational emissions of a building, so the emissions caused by, you know, the lights that I have turned on over here. But because we're talking so much about refurbishing, recycling, I would like your opinion, Hubert, and I'd like to start with you on the importance of embodied carbon in this whole package, let's say.
Yeah, when we started the journey, we desperately were looking for a system gives us an idea about the embodied carbon, and we realized nobody gives a fuck. So if you're sitting in the CREM work group for North America and you talk with the institutional investors, they all are only looking on their carbon glide paths on the CREM, a few F gases, and that's done. So in short, out of the practice, I guess it's an illusion that we come anytime soon to the embedded carbon calculation, even so we know that embedded carbon is much more higher in the momentum as, sorry, I'm on the airport.
No worries. So I guess you're getting a boarding call. We don't hear any background noise, by the way, Hubert.
Okay, that's good. Then I bet she's overturning me. I'm sorry for the audience. Okay, so the embedded carbon discussion is something I would say picks up in 3-4 years. We use the embedded carbon calculation only for the life cycle assessment when we're replacing technical installation yet.
Eleni.
Yes, you're so ready to jump in. I think the conversation around embodied carbon is much stronger in countries where there's still a lot of development happening. I think to have it take a bigger role in countries where we're looking at particularly areas like light retrofit, it does sometimes feel like a distraction to really focus on embodied carbon. However, obviously with deep retrofit and anything that requires a change of materials, embodied carbon should absolutely be considered. But really, embodied carbon should be top of mind for any type of new development. And also on Hubert's point around the embodied carbon calculator, looks like we lost him. But there are some calculators coming up now, actually, that allow people to just get that sense and to be able to make better decisions. I'm happy to share some resources afterwards, but I do think more and more emphasis is being placed on getting that information so that people can make better decisions. But I think for where we are right now, it's not necessarily a bad thing to look at operational emissions. It really depends on where a company is in their journey and what they're looking at. And also thinking again about where are the low-hanging fruit, operational emissions, changing behavior patterns, doing some of these things that Hubert was talking about around changing things like sensors or any kinds of changes that can really reduce should be an immediate priority, because there are things that are in our control and often require much less investment upfront.
Monika, would you like to jump in?
Sure. I think we're opening the whole discussion about the circular economy here, and reusing of building materials, reusing, upcycling, repairing, and that really is a huge area whereby, I mean, according to obviously taxonomy, we're supposed to be reusing the minimum of 70% of building materials if we're constructing a building on a site with an existing building. But having said that, if we're looking at retrofits, I mean, the same situation applies, reusing and upcycling of existing building materials, which is, from at least my experience over the last 5 years in this area, I think quite a challenge, especially in our part of Europe, to convince market players this is of importance and this is actually our future, whereby we'll be moving our linear economy into circular economy, reusing materials, bearing in mind that there is a clear finite position regarding the natural resources, whereby we're already seeing some of them coming to the end within the next few years. So with that in mind, we may actually find ourselves in a situation that we no longer have natural resources or resources that we can use for real estate construction, for example. And therefore our mindset, perhaps, and education should be really moving towards exploring the circular economy principles and application of circular economy in real estate construction, retrofits of all kinds, even simple solutions like refit out of office space. That's probably the simplest one to look at, and it's a completely different business model, which again has to really evolve. And I've seen quite a lot of that as examples in Western Europe, as opposed to Eastern Europe, whereby I can't see the evidence of any enthusiasm towards circular economy coming from the banks, for example, financial institutions, or to a very limited degree of large investment funds.
And Nicole, I see that you wish to jump in. Before you do so, if I may, because we did also get a question in the Q&A, which I think very well connects to this. And so we have a person here who asks for your point of view on the for example, HVAC equipment that is required for electrification, and that producers very much do not seem prepared to provide the solutions that we need to get to where we want to go, which is what we're talking about.
I'm not sure I got the first part, so if you want to maybe repeat that, sorry about that.
Yeah, so we're now having this little discussion about refurbishing and how we need to reuse the materials that we have. And so in the Q&A, we got an interesting question about producers not seeming to be prepared to offer feasible solutions. So when it comes to this reusing of not only brick but also, let's say, the installations within a building, how do you see that?
Well, again, I think it's very important to make educated decisions when it comes to this highly expensive type of renovation works. And I think taking action on emissions often boils down to a nuanced discussion between building owners and tenants. And as I said, there is one component that focuses on the operations, so that's on the tenant side, and one that it's focused on the owner's side. Now, I'm not sure if equipment providers are not willing to, jump on this train. I think it's the resistance that Robbie was talking about is getting used to being, set in their own ways and keeping the old, with both hands, as it usually happens with change. But I think once the landlord has a clear image of the digital tool, like where the building is losing energy in the insulation, in the facade, in glazing, and so on and so forth, then okay, he will make the decisions. He will look at the equipment to change big HVAC equipment, that's still sitting in the life cycle. I don't think that's the way, but to tackle the BMS, that might be a solution, So there are various ways. There are various ways to tackle this, to find the best opportunity for your building to behave as you want it to behave, net zero, hopefully by 2050, and bring the suppliers on board, explain why they need to be, part of this journey. Because if they're a big company, they have their own targets to meet. They have their own, CSRD reporting to take care of. So they will all be interested to be part of the conversation, and they will not resist. That's my hope.
Eleni?
I think we're at that intersection right now, and I would agree with Nicole that there's the leaders and the laggards, and that's true in every single sector. There are people that are realizing that this is the future and they're adapting their business models, and there are other people that are hoping that everything's going to delay a little bit and they can keep business as usual. And I'll come back to my original comment around where are we with ESG today, maintaining the status quo. I think the truth is, from my perspective, that there's been a lot of progress from the top 1%, 5%, and then the rest of the industry is just kind of sitting back and waiting to see what they should do and when it's going to become so mandatory that they can't change it. I think the reality is ESG requires a change in business. It requires a change in the way that we perceive returns. It requires a change in what we value. And I think, to Monika's point, valuations, there's a lot of complexity, and it's not just I stuck a solar panel on my rooftop and now I'm green and on ESG and everything's fine. It really does require redefining. And I think just the same way that real estate is having some struggles with it, it's the same way with suppliers. Now, I do think there are people that are seeing the opportunity. The question also becomes then, how can people find those suppliers and the availability of information, marketplaces? I think there's a resurging interest right now, particularly in the startup world, for platforms that are starting to connect players with some of these solutions. And I'm sure we're going to see more of that moving forward. I've seen some of that in materials as well. So a lot of the innovative bio-based materials that are trying to get into real estate construction that are more focused on circular economy or reusing products, etc. So I think there's quite a big change, but the same as with all sustainability related topics, there's leaders, and then there's everybody else who's kind of sitting back and waiting to see what's going to happen.
And I would just comment on that a bit, because we see, some companies, waving from the platform, not being part of this fast-running train. And for them, kicking the can down the road in 2050 is not a viable option for any business or government. So the demand for these sustainable products from investors, tenants, banks is increasing, and the trend is here to stay and will not reverse, unlike, you know, our hope from others. So in just 6 years from now, at the end of this decade, we will find ourselves in a completely different reality, where the common knowledge about sustainability will not allow greenwashing or any other, you know, just empty words in a report anymore. That's my take. So it's a fast-running train. Jump on it now, or you'll be out of business soon.
If I may jump in on that, so I also, and Robbie mentioned this as well. There are quite a few regulatory changes coming our way. Some have come already, taxonomy. We've got, of course, the CSRD, where I have heard that there are companies already reporting according to the new ESRS. I would like to hear your opinions on what the planned and expected regulatory changes that we have, which ones will have the biggest impact on strategies in the coming years. And Monika, if you could kick that one off, please.
So I was slightly taken back by the fact that the CSDD regulation that was going to come in this year has not really been sort of moving forward, and that's something that has been discussed for quite a long time over the last 12 months or longer, and that is something that perhaps will come with a positive move in towards the end of this year, maybe. But that has something that has been quite interesting to unravel, as it were, because that was an expectancy that will come into legislation sometime this year.
Nicole? You're on mute.
I did it again. Oops, sorry. So I was just, getting a bit of context on the CSRD requirements and so on and so forth. And I think just by looking at the numbers of number of companies required to report on the CSRD, we're just moving on to what was it, 12,000, I think, on the non-financial disclosure. 12,000 to 15,000 is a huge change. It's times 5. So I think what's interesting is that companies will need to start practicing, because first years of reporting will be, complete failure. We all know that. But we start practicing, we start gathering data, we start setting out, clear KPIs. As Robbie was mentioning, consolidate, standardize, all this will help them get better practice. What I would like to see is also, we know the next steps, it's coming, it's unavoidable, unavoidable. But what I would like to see is companies really getting sanctioned if they're not doing that in local legislations. And that's something that still is, under discussion and not yet very clear. Well, that's my understanding, at least.
Eleni.
Yeah, slightly different perspective. I think even though it already exists, I think the EU taxonomy has the biggest domino effect across Europe and frankly the world, because any European investor or European asset owner who's got assets in non-EU countries is also being affected by taxonomy. So I've got clients in Africa who are saying EU taxonomy. I've got clients in South America that are saying EU taxonomy. So there's quite a strong domino effect. I think EU taxonomy had a bit of a rough start with very complex, understanding requirements, people trying to figure out what does it mean, how to report, what classifies as EU taxonomy or not. But I think the fact of the matter is that money talks, and when money says you have to do this, people listen. And that's a very, very strong driver for people to really take ESG seriously, really green their assets and figure out what are those minimum benchmarks and work towards them. Really starting to see a rise in real estate of the use of sustainability linked instruments. And I think that's going to be a really interesting instrument to drive change, because it's moving away from a tick box exercise and saying you must have a certificate or do this one thing, and rather look at ongoing progress, ongoing performance improvement. So coming back to some of our earlier conversations around, is a certificate enough, and what does a long-term reduced environmental impact look like? I think having your financing tied to your sustainability KPIs around real estate and showing continuous improvement is a very, very good way of making sure that the industry continually moves forward. And I think the more that that's being integrated into banking, the bigger the impact we're going to see. Slightly cynical addition to that, though, is that I think banks are under a lot of pressure to finance the transition, but are reluctant to take on what that means in terms of the returns that they're going to get. And currently there's a bit of a, let me classify things that are doing really well as green because they already fit the criterion, as opposed to focusing on true transition finance and actually helping the really hard to abate sectors or the hard to abate buildings into something green, because it will affect the bottom line. So there's a lot still to be seen on the financing side. But from my perspective, I think EU taxonomy is probably going to be the strongest domino effect globally for sustainability.
Hubert's back. We've missed you for a while. We don't see you, so I hope you're listening in. Oh, you're on the plane actually. How many minutes to take off?
7.
7. Okay. Oh, that's perfect timing. So in case you missed it, so we were talking about the impact of the regulatory changes that are coming over the next period. We'd like to hear, for as long as it's possible for you, because I mean, taking off is of course you need to shut everything off. So we'd like to have your opinion on this.
Yes, thank you very much. We mentioned that already in the pre-discussion. If we do not change the incentives, we will not get the results which we desire, right? So that means we need to come from the supervisory boards. They need to talk to their management and tell them, guys, boni is only due if you reach your ESG goals. And if this incentive is hard and interesting enough at the same time, then we will see the necessary changes, because ESG is only working top down. It's not working bottom up, never. If the management doesn't go all in, there can be the best ESG specialist in the company. It's designed for failure, right? It's really not working. We see that so often. We did polls and we do that regularly. Bottleneck number 1 is lacking C-level supply, and bottleneck number 2, as we mentioned before, is education. Bring that together and you have 70% of the industry on your side, and you make already a necessary change. That's the impact, right? And it doesn't mean so much, again, what new regulations coming up. It's much more the incentive. And yes, banks have the major key here, because money talks. So if they take their role serious, I don't say they should kill the industry, but if they take the role serious, then customer has no choice but to follow. And also here, it's education, clearly, right? And that means greenwashing is not an option anymore. And we know if the management realizes that they are personally responsible, what we see at DWS, the German fund from the Deutsche Bank last year, the CEO is prosecuted because of capital fraud. Because they changed the reporting, but they didn't change the asset class and anything on the fundamentals. And this is perceived as capital fraud, and it's serious. So I think, yeah, it's high time for the management to think in a new way, and also to protect the company and the employees, not only the investments.
Also, just to complete what Hubert said, just before the plane takes off, banks are also sitting on the side of the table where they have their targets. That's very interesting, right? Because they are big organizations. They will need to report. They will need to make sure they hit the goals and the targets they set from themselves. And still, that's to me, a puzzle, how they don't act upon it, since they are also themselves in the position when they need to invest to decarbonize and so on and so forth. Us as an organization, CBRE, will need to decarbonize. We are I mean, our targets are 10 years ahead the EU. So to be net zero by 2040. So for us, it's a huge pressure to do it, to invest in it, and to make sure we implement and follow the targets. And we are sitting on the same side of the table as our clients. And it's very important to see, you know, how you put yourself in the place of your clients and you make sure you hold them by hand and understand their needs because you're in the same boat. That's very interesting.
The pressure will come from the capital markets. As soon the rating comes down and the rating agencies will follow the rules and they say, okay, your portfolio is not green enough, means you're failing on the rating, your refinancing costs going up. From that moment of time, you will see a tsunami coming over to the real estate industry and demanding exactly what's written already today in the laws and regulations. The only problem is it's not enough time to react for the industry because we all know implementing a valid strategy takes 2 to 3 years at least. So it's high time really to take precaution measures to be prepared, right? And that's the point. That's my take here.
So we're almost at the end of the conversation here, time-wise. Therefore, I'd like to take this opportunity to hear some final words from you. And again, we have a question in the Q&As here, where the question is, Europe is relatively small compared to the rest of the world. And so if you could, each one of you, and we'll start by Hubert, again, because of the plane, give your opinion on, is what's happening in Europe, will that be impactful enough on the global stage?
No, clearly no. We left the science-based discussion when we entered into the taxonomy. In US, it's the Inflation Reduction Act. There are 380 billion to grab. We do it by regulation. But what we can create is a business opportunity to educate other industry or other countries and enter there, be it by services, be it by software, be it by development, be it by joint ventures, whatever. But it's not the question at all, because for us, it's a question of life or death. Because if we do not follow, the bank will not finance, the tenant will not pick up the product. If they do that in India, who gives a fuck? My business is in Europe. My employees are in Europe. I need to break my business here. I can't save the world. That's a mission impossible, but I can make sure that my business stays profitable for the near future. And that's the take.
Monika? Monika?
Yes, I would say we are leading by example. So frankly, if we're looking at the European legislation, is obviously number one. And clearly we are also seeing the evidence of, say, taxonomy in Asia, in countries like Singapore, even China is actually moving towards taxonomy. So if we're leading by example, at least we are setting a blueprint for other countries to follow. And I believe that will happen in the foreseeable future.
Nicole.
I would touch a subject that has not been tackled so much, is the green leases, which is also part of you know, the let's say legislation, and I see instances of those being sort of clarified a bit in France, and getting obligation to have this into contracts. So I would stress the importance of having this or getting to practice these green leases ahead of time, let's say ahead of legislation coming in, because I think sharing the risk and the cost between landlord and tenant, it's a huge importance in reaching out those targets for the future. And I want to see them again translated into legislation so that it's easier and more standardized for everyone to understand and to implement.
Eleni.
I would say, regardless of how big Europe is, we each have a role to play. And if we all look at each other and wait for the bigger countries to jump in, then we're all going to miss the net zero transition. I would also say that even though we look at emerging economies and think they're not doing anything, in many ways they've leapfrogged over Europe's examples. Colombia, for example, 20% of all new builds are certified as green and being built as green, which is incredible market penetration, and it's just becoming business as usual. I just got back from a 2-week trip from India yesterday, and it's the, I think, second largest green building market in the world, where most new construction is adopting green principles. So I would say there's a lot of hope in the world, and people look to Europe as an example, look for best practice constantly. So we serve as a leading example, but also we have a responsibility for the amount that we control and for the emissions that we make. We should make sure that we reduce them.
All right. Thank you very much. This was invigorating. Quite a few interesting topics, I believe, that we've touched. I do have the feeling that if we were to have a glass of coffee, I was going to say something more alcoholic, but if we were together in the room and we'd have a couple of drinks, I'm sure that we could go on for hours and hours, which might actually be really interesting if you put a camera on it. But thank you very much to the panelists